And the Trudeau government is a really good segue for what we're going to talk about next, which is Edmonton's new mayor, Amarjeet Sohi, who coincidentally was around when all of this was happening as a fairly powerful cabinet minister in Justin Trudeau's Liberal government when he had a majority in Parliament. So a majority in Parliament, a powerful cabinet position, really a seat at the table, this metaphor that's always being thrown around, everyone sitting at the table and figuring out our differences. Well, Mr. Sohi was at the table for a very long time at the highest level of government with influence and power to, seemingly do what's right and not perform and really meet expectations for people who need it the most. But we're in the current state that we are now with our country. The Liberal Party and its failures are well documented. And it seems like Sohi has been able to fly above all that criticism, at least when it comes to his performance in the recent election. And I think one thing that really strikes me, or at least that I think is worth thinking about, is this idea of BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, and how significant or insignificant that is with Amarjeet Sohi winning as a South Asian man, and how Alberta has 2 South Asian mayors as their representatives in the major cities, and how that's somehow a really meaningful thing. And I think the term BIPOC especially flattens a lot of identities into this nice, neat category that I think is often used to make white people feel better about, the fact that opportunities haven't been provided for these communities, or that there are still many systemic barriers that are in place that really prevent it, that really prevent Indigenous people, that really prevent Black people, and anyone who doesn't, again, fit within this performance or doesn't fit within this status quo, those people don't really get. So with that being said, I still understand the urge and the need to feel very sentimental about these people who are kind of put on a pedestal as representatives of the community and of larger change. I still remember pretty vividly when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and personally, my family was overjoyed. I remember, this excitement, this almost like a cathartic release of joy and happiness, that the possibilities were endless for any Black person to achieve the highest office, seemingly in the world. But when you really look back at what this president's legacy was and what was actually accomplished for people in a meaningful way, whether it comes to healthcare, whether it comes to systemic barriers for racialized people, a lot of those things lack short, because I think ultimately it came down to a performance. And as long as things are put in these kind of categories of, just because you serve this identity group, you're somehow going to bring about change, or you're not going to be questioned or pushed as hard on how you're actually going to implement things, we're going to see the same result, and we're going to see the same disappointment, and we're not going to see change within the status quo. So when it comes down to it, representation, whether it's under the banner or umbrella of BIPOC, whatever that means, really isn't enough. Because when it comes down to it, what we don't need is another person who is in a position to not do anything, but this time that person somehow represents an unrepresented group. Fundamentally, it doesn't even matter who takes up these positions, as long as they actually do something that's meaningful to actually change the status quo. If you have someone that's of a different race, or that comes from a different background, or that represents a group that has been historically excluded, like I said, that is good for a lot of different reasons, but when it comes down to the reasons that should matter, it really, really, really does not matter. And fundamentally, it should matter if that person is pushing the status quo and bringing about systemic change, not necessarily what their background is and how that is used in an often sentimental way to obscure from the actual issues. So going back to Sohi and his platform, I think one thing that really strikes me, that really shows some of how his platform can be seen as performative or in lockstep with what we've seen before from the Liberal government, is some of the rhetoric and some of the policies around community safety, policing, and this new wave of hate crime in Edmonton. So when I talked about this rhetoric of bringing people around the table and having these, deep, meaningful conversations that will somehow, change big, serious problems that are often systemic and often tied to funding, money, power. It doesn't seem like these things are being meaningfully addressed. It seems like we're kind of continuing the same cycle of performance. And I think if you look at a platform here that's publicly available, I think you can kind of see where I'm kind of coming from. So under Amarjeet Sohi's Safe Communities for All, and under the applying the right resources to keep communities safe, I think you really get to see that while Amarjeet Sohi is invested in, being there for Black lives, talking about his own personal experience with racism, in an attempt to connect with people, fundamentally, I think it's still a lot more of the same. And I don't think people should necessarily be surprised when we see things like an increased police budget or a similar police budget or support for things that aren't necessarily beneficial, because this is the rhetoric in the platform. Quote, "Police are a fundamental part of community safety, but we cannot keep diverting them away from their core mandate. Sometimes they are not the right service to be attending to an issue in the community." And then there's more about Edmonton and how it's come to create this innovative community safety tool around help, this new community policing pilot. But I think that initial sentence really struck me as a real deep commitment to the status quo. And really, I think when you hear stories, for example, like this Indigenous teenager that had his head kicked in by a police officer, and that caused serious brain damage, which he can't get a surgery for now because of COVID, so he has to wear a helmet. Learning that police officer was a school resource officer, a program that's been, vigorously defended by various city administrators, various Catholic school board and public school board administrators, defended using racist language and insinuation that refugees are somehow more dangerous than other people. And then so to hear all that and to understand the history and the current context of policing in our city and how all of that can kind of be crumpled and crushed down into one sentence that, police are a fundamental part of community safety. It feels very strange. It feels very strange to have that be, the real rhetoric. And it only feels strange, I think, because I know that Mayor Sohi is still trying to appeal to both sides and still trying to perform that, these issues are serious and that, fundamental change can somehow happen while still being, deeply invested and, supportive of this system that is often incredibly violent and destructive to Indigenous and Black people's lives. So performance while still upholding the status quo, I think, is the kind of name of the game. And I think I definitely got to see a lot of that when I had the chance to interview Amarjeet Sohi. And it was one of those things where I think that I could have done a better job at asking more challenging questions, or questions that probed and pushed him to answer more honestly, or to show more of what he actually believed. I think in the interview, I gave him more space than was necessary to, I guess, say what he said in his platform, which is a lot of what I think is performance and trying to appeal to both sides of the issue. When, quite honestly, the reality is that there's mostly just an appeal to the status quo and to making sure that things stay the way they are, and that if they do change, they can still stay relatively in control and in a way that doesn't shake things up too much. So in the interview, I do wish and I do regret not being able to have pushed him a little bit further. But if anything, I think his answers really do speak for themselves. And I think really do show a side of him that people should be wary of. And, you know, when Joe Biden was running for president in America, very, you know, different situation than what we're dealing with in Edmonton, but there was a very big rhetoric of, you know, let's push this person to the left, or, you know, we can somehow, you know, influence their politics once they get elected. Because it seems that, you know, when politicians get elected, you know, they always say, okay, now we can get to work. When oftentimes it's really the opposite that happens. Once they're elected, they've centered politics on the lives and the journeys of like getting elected, but oftentimes when they get into those positions, very little actually happens that isn't outside of this like procedural script, you know, of just like continuing the city administration, continuing the same policies, continuing the same bylaws, of course making tweaks, of course making changes, but again, only insofar as they continue this original plan that's always been running underneath there. So going back to the Joe Biden situation, I don't think that's going very well right now. I think things are still incredibly dysfunctional and things are still incredibly difficult because, like I said, once you actually get into power, it's not about making right on all the promises that you made before or getting right to work like is being said. It's usually about, like I said, continuing the status quo and pushing these people to the left, or, you know, claiming that what we need to do is get them elected and then we have some influence or power, I think is a very misguided thing.